The next question comes from Sham, my good friend Sham. Here's what Sham asks. Hey Zach, I was wondering if you could do an episode regarding when to breathe to bias different expansion strategies for some upper body weight room exercises. Pull-ups, chest-supported rows, incline presses, alternating rows / presses, one-arm pull-downs, if you haven't already. Thanks. Well, Sham, I haven't already, or at least I didn't as comprehensive as I'm going to now. So let's go through each of the activities that Sham has mentioned, and we'll go through the full cycle. Let's start with a pull-up. Boom, I'm going to set myself up in a dead hang. I wasn't sure if I had the armpit sweat because it's a little hot in here. I'm in the dead hang of the pull-up. I could argue breathing in or breathing out in either of those situations. Both are going to influence relative bucket handle mechanics. If I let out a full exhale, I will do a great job of closing the bucket handle. So that's great for a wide infrasternal angle. If I exhale, keep my ab tension, and inhale at the bottom, that could totes my goats get me more bucket handle for someone like a narrow infrasternal angle. Also, when I'm overhead, you're going to get some pump handle expansion. If you can keep the stack, you may get a little bit of upper back expansion. But because when you're in a dead hang of a pull-up, you are in relative IR at the humerus. Why? Your elbows are flaring out generally, especially if I'm doing an overhand grip. That will drive more air into the front side of the body. That's just the start. If you're pulling and you go chest to bar, which is how I like my pull-ups, as the scaps are getting more downwardly rotated and they're retracted, that's going to allow more air in the front. So if you breathe into the top part of the pull-up, you will get more pump handle mechanics. Now, one issue with this, if you're doing this under heavy load, or you're like me and 177 pounds is heavy load for you because you're weak, that may lead to increased compressive or concentric bias throughout the body, and it might not be the best move for you to get air in. Because if you need to generate a lot of tension or produce a lot of force to perform the task, you're going to have more concentric bias. And that's going to reduce the amount of airflow that you're going to get. That's pretty normal. You want that to produce force. You could use a pull-up to bias air into certain parts of the rib cage, but it might not be your go-to reset. Let's go into a chest-supported row next. Chest-supported row is predominantly going to be pump handle bias, and normally that's because you're at 90 degrees-ish of shoulder flexion. When you're at 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, based on the scapular positioning, check the reaching theory and practice debrief that I'll link in the show notes. But that's going to create external rotation of the scaps. When you got external rotation of the scaps, that's going to reduce air going in the back and increase air going in the front. If you breathe in at the start, you're going to get some expansion in the front, but less so than if you take your breath of air in with the scaps pulled together. That's going to bias even more air into the front. Now here's the cool thing. If you do one side at a time, maybe you don't got the fancy chest-supported row machine. Like I don't have that. I haven't had one in a while. I used to like them. But if you're doing one side at a time, you can actually drive some degree of rotation in the trunk. Now, you got to be thinking, well, Zach, I remember that one debrief you shared a long time ago, and when you were talking about that, you had to have some expansion on the front side of one side of the rib cage and then posterior expansion on the opposite side to drive rotation. But you just said this is more pump handle bias. If I'm pump handling on both sides, how can I rotate? The answer is degrees. If, let's say I'm rowing with my left arm, there's going to be more pump handle on the left side, but there's going to be less pump handle relative to the left on the right. Because I have this gradient, that's going to actually drive some rotation. And the way I would be rotating would actually be, well, this is interesting, would actually be relatively to the right in terms of the spine. And the reason why that is because wherever I'm getting posterior expansion, which in this case would be more on the right, the thoracic spine would actually rotate that direction, because when I expand posteriorly, the spinous processes are going to move to the right. So you'd actually get more posterior expansion on the right side, which is kind of cool. But this would be, also think about this too, right? Because I am getting some degree of pump handle on both sides, because you're seeing, right? Well, Zach, as you're pulling that way, your body's going to the left. Yes, and that has to be because what happens is, because I've pump handled on both sides, I'm getting a leftward orientation of my thorax, and then if I breathe in this position, I would be right moving or rotating to the right from a leftward starting point. Just like I could extend my elbow, hang on, pow, there we go. I could extend my elbow, and right now, if I stop, you look at me, and it's like, well, Zach, your elbow's flexed, what the heck's going on? Well, this is true, but the movement itself that's occurring is towards extension. When I'm in this position on the row, where my left arm's pulling, my right arm's reaching, it looks like I'm rotating to the left, but if I breathe here, I'm actually driving rotation to the right. So that would be the long and the short example with chest-supported row. So it's generally a pump handle bias, but if you do unilateral actions, you will get some rotation happening. Usually the rotation is going to be oriented towards one direction and then attempting to rotate to the opposite direction, even though it might not drive full visual rotation that way. Next, we got incline presses. I love incline presses. Incline presses are also pump handle bias. Why? When I'm at an incline, I'm going relatively overhead, and let's just say we start with a low incline. 60 to 120 degrees of shoulder flexion are going to drive more air into the front. So if I'm at an incline press, that's going to drive more air in the front. If I'm doing alternating dumbbell style, that's going to do similar rotation things as we saw with the chest-supported row. Cool thing is, the higher you go up, the more of an incline that you get, the more shoulder flexion you drive, the more expansion is going to be allowed in the dorsal rostral area. T2, T4, T5, 6, somewhere around there. So you will actually get more upper posterior expansion the higher you go. That's going to drive a greater amount of rotation than what we saw with the chest-supported row. And it will actually create a better gradient than the chest-supported row. Because as I get into that overhead position, now I'm allowing for more posterior expansion to happen, which means you drive more relative rotation from a respiratory perspective. If you're doing some heavy-ass incline presses and you're doing it bilaterally, that's going to be more concentric in nature. You need it to move the weights, so the rotational amounts will likely be less. But you could still argue driving some pump handle, and then as you go closer to overhead or even an Arnold press, you're likely going to get more upper back expansion, T2, T4 area. One-arm pull-downs. Ooh, I love these. And I'm going to link in the show notes, and I'm going to try actually to in the show notes, just because I want to over-deliver for you fine folks, like have a little like blog summary on each of these points. But with one-arm pull-downs, very similar to the chin-up, but you can drive more air with these exercises, which I really like. And you got to try out this rib shake pull-down that I've been messing with some clients. It's money. It's money. It leads to some nice movement changes. If you're starting at the top, and you breathe in, that's going to drive more bucket handle mechanics, which is really good, especially if you throw any side bending into the mix. You'll also get some A to P expansion in the upper thorax, depending on where your arm rotation is. If your elbow's pointing out, it's going to be more air in the front. If you're more supinated and your arm is pointing inward or your elbow's pointing inward, that's going to drive more air in the back. Then as I pull down, that can help you close the bucket handle. Great for you wide infrasternal angle folks on that side. And here's the cool thing, if you're doing something on the opposite side, maybe I'm doing an alternating pull down and I breathe in, you can drive more bucket handle expansion on the opposite side. I close down one side, open up the other, you get air going into those areas. And then same thing, if I'm more internally rotated at the arm, that's going to drive more air in the front. If I'm more externally rotated, that's going to drive more air in the back. And those would be all the exercises that Sham had mentioned. To give you a brief summary, I won't go into specific moves, but you just got to think about where your arms are. If your scaps are getting pulled back, rows, you're doing an eccentric on a press, that's going to drive more air in the front. If you're reaching more forward, you're going maybe lower, that will drive relative air in the back, but you still might get some air in the front depending on the angle that you're reaching at. Check out the reaching debrief that I'll link in the show notes. If I go overhead, I will get more expansion in the upper segments of the rib cage. And anytime I go overhead and I breathe in and breathe out, that can also influence bucket handle mechanics.